Grant Priscilla thought he had committed the perfect crime. He had the billions, the mistress, and the ironclad prenup that would leave his wife Natalie sleeping in her car. On the morning of the final hearing, he was already celebrating. He told his friends she was a nobody from nowhere, a fixer-upper he was finally discarding. He thought he knew everything about the woman he shared a bed with for 5 years. But when the gavel banged and the judge looked over his glasses to ask one simple question, "Mr. Priscilla, do you know who your wife's father is?" the laughter stopped, and the nightmare began. The crystal flute shattered against the marble fireplace, but nobody cared. In the penthouse suite of the Four Seasons in Manhattan, the mood was electric. Grant Priscilla, the 38-year-old CEO of Priscilla Dynamics, was standing on a velvet ottoman, a fresh bottle of Dom Perignon in one hand and a Cuban cigar in the other. "To freedom," Grant bellowed, his face flushed with the kind of arrogance that only money and unchecked power can buy. A chorus of cheers erupted from the room. It was a small gathering, his inner circle. There was Brad, his VP of operations, Chloe, his 23-year-old personal assistant, and the reason for the divorce, and Benton Hughes, the most expensive divorce attorney in New York State. Chloe slinked up to Grant, wrapping a manicured hand around his ankle. "Baby, get down before you break your neck. You need to be in court in 3 hours." Grant laughed, hopping down and pulling Chloe into a deep performative kiss. "Court, Chloe, today isn't a trial. It's a formality. It's a signature. It's taking out the trash." Benton Hughes, sitting in a leather armchair, checking his Rolex, cleared his throat. "Grant is right, technically. The prenup Natalie signed 5 years ago is a work of art. I wrote it myself. It stipulates that in the event of infidelity on her part, which we manufactured beautifully with those doctored photos, or irreconcilable differences initiated by Grant, she leaves with exactly what she came in with." "Which was nothing," Grant sneered, pouring more champagne. "She was a waitress in a diner in Ohio. I found her. I polished her. I bought her the clothes, the etiquette lessons, the jewelry, and now I'm taking it all back. The jewelry stays in the vault. The clothes stay in the closet. She walks out of that courtroom with a suitcase of Target t-shirts and a bus ticket back to Cornfield, USA. Brad chuckled nervously. "She didn't fight back at all. No countersuit. That's the beauty of it," Grant said, his eyes gleaming with malice. "She's too stupid to fight. For the last month since I served her the papers, she's just been quiet, walking around the penthouse like a ghost. She didn't even hire a lawyer. She's using a court-appointed public defender, some kid named Samuel, who probably hasn't even passed the bar yet." Grant walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over Central Park. He felt invincible. His tech company was about to go public with a valuation of $4 billion. He was trading in his 30-year-old wife for a 23-year-old model. And he was going to keep every single penny of his fortune. "I almost feel bad for her," Chloe giggled, sipping her drink. "Almost." "Don't," Grant said, turning back to them. Natalie was a leech. She enjoyed the high life, the galas, the trips to Saint-Tropez. But she never fit in. She was always too soft, too quiet. She never understood that in this world you have to be a shark. Well, today, the shark eats. He checked his watch, a Patek Philippe Nautilus that cost more than Natalie's childhood home. "All right, let's sober up. I want to look sharp when I destroy her." The atmosphere in the Suffolk County Supreme Court was sterile and cold. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low-level anxiety that usually made Grant twitch, but today he felt nothing but calm superiority. He sat at the mahogany table flanked by Benton Hughes and 2 junior associates. They looked like a squadron of sharks in Armani suits. Benton was arranging his papers with geometric precision, humming a tune under his breath. On the other side of the aisle sat Natalie. Grant looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time in months. She looked pathetic. She was wearing a simple grey dress that he vaguely remembered her buying at a department store years ago before he had forbidden her from shopping off the rack. Her hair, usually styled by the best salons in the city, was pulled back in a severe, messy bun. No makeup, no jewelry. Her hands were folded in her lap, her knuckles white. Next to her sat her lawyer. Grant had to stifle a laugh. The man looked like he was 12 years old. His suit was ill-fitting, the sleeves too long, and he was nervously clicking a cheap ballpoint pen. He had a stack of disorganized papers in front of him and was whispering frantically to Natalie. Natalie didn't respond. She just stared straight ahead at the empty judge's bench. "Look at them," Grant whispered to Benton. "It's like bringing a plastic spoon to a gunfight." Benton smirked. "Don't get cocky. Just let me do the talking. We present the prenup. We present the separation of assets. We ask for immediate eviction from the marital residence. Judge Harrison is presiding today. He's a hard ass, hates emotional outbursts. He'll love our efficiency." "Judge Harrison," Grant frowned. "I thought we had Judge Miller. Last-minute switch." Benton shrugged. "Doesn't matter. The law is the law, and the contract is ironclad." The bailiff's voice cut through the air. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Harrison presiding." The door to the chambers opened, and Judge Harrison walked in. He was a terrifying figure, an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with steel-grey hair and a face carved from granite. He didn't look at the lawyers. He didn't look at the gallery. He sat down, adjusted his robe, and opened the file in front of him with a heavy thud. "Be seated," the judge rumbled. His voice was deep gravelly and echoed in the silent room. Grant sat down, smoothing his tie. He caught Natalie's eye for a split second. He expected to see fear, tears, begging. Instead, he saw something that unsettled him. Her eyes were dry, and they were cold, ice cold. For a fleeting second, the mousy waitress from Ohio vanished, and something else looked back at him. But then she blinked, and the look was gone, replaced by the submissive, downward gaze he was used to. "Docket number 4921. Judge Harrison read his eyes scanning the papers. "Priscilla versus Priscilla. Petition for divorce, division of assets, and enforcement of prenuptial agreement. Castle, ready for the plaintiff, Your Honor," Benton said, standing up smoothly. "Ready for the defendant, Your Honor," the young lawyer squeaked, standing up halfway, before sitting back down nervously. "Mr. Hughes," the judge said, looking at Benton. "I've reviewed the filing. You are claiming that the prenuptial agreement bars Mrs. Priscilla from any claim to the marital assets, spousal support, or the primary residence. Is that correct?" "That is correct, Your Honor," Benton said, walking toward the bench. "The agreement was signed 5 years ago, notarized and witnessed. Mrs. Priscilla was of sound mind. The terms are explicit. Whatever Mr. Priscilla acquired during the marriage remains his sole property. Whatever Mrs. Priscilla brought into the marriage, which the financial disclosure shows, was approximately $200 in a checking account, and a 2012 Honda Civic remains hers." Grant smirked. He loved hearing that part. "And," Benton continued, "given the swift nature of these proceedings, we are asking for an order for Mrs. Priscilla to vacate the penthouse by 5:00 p.m. today." The judge didn't nod. He didn't look impressed. He just turned his gaze slowly toward the defense table. "And you, Mr." The judge squinted at the nameplate. Mr. Kincaid, do you have a rebuttal? The young lawyer, Samuel Kincaid, stood up. His hands were shaking slightly. Your Honor, yes, we are not contesting the divorce. My client wants the divorce just as much as Mr. Priscilla does. Grant snorted. Of course she does. She wants to get out before I humiliate her further. However, Samuel continued, his voice gaining a tiny bit of strength, we are contesting the validity of the prenuptial agreement. Benton laughed out loud. Validity on what grounds? It's standard boilerplate. On the grounds of fraud and coercion, Samuel said, swallowing hard. Fraud? Benton shot back, indignant. Miss Priscilla is a pillar of the business community. This is a desperate attempt to grab cash. Judge Harrison held up a hand. The room went silent instantly. Mr. Kincaid, the judge said softly. Fraud is a serious accusation. Do you have evidence? We do, Your Honor, Samuel said. He reached into his messy stack of papers and pulled out a single, thick blue envelope. It wasn't a legal document. It looked like personal stationery. But before we submit it, my client requests permission to address the court directly. Benton jumped up. Objection. She has counsel. This is grandstanding. Judge Harrison looked at Natalie. She was still sitting perfectly still. Overruled, the judge said. It's a divorce hearing, Mr. Hughes, not a murder trial. If Mrs. Priscilla wants to speak, let her speak. Grant rolled his eyes. Let her cry, he thought. Let her beg. It will make the victory sweeter. Natalie stood up. The change in her posture was subtle but immediate. The shoulders that had been slumped for 5 years suddenly squared. She didn't smooth her dress. She didn't fidget with her hair. She walked to the center of the room, standing directly in front of the judge's bench, ignoring the podium. She didn't look at the judge. She turned slowly, deliberately to face Grant. 5 years ago. Natalie began, her voice not shaky, but clear and resonant. Grant told me he loved me. He told me he wanted to take care of me. I was 22. I was working double shifts to pay for my mother's medical bills. I was tired, and he looked like a prince. She took a step toward Grant's table. Benton Hughes looked ready to tackle her, but Grant waved him off. He was amused. He told me the prenup was just a formality, Natalie continued. He said his board of directors required it. He said, Natalie, it's just paper. What's mine is yours. I believed him, because I didn't know that what was his wasn't actually his money. Grant's smile faltered. What is she talking about? He hissed to Benton. I didn't know. Natalie said, her voice dropping an octave, that Grant Priscilla's initial capital, the seed money for Priscilla Dynamics, didn't come from his own savings. It came from an illegal loan shark operation run out of New Jersey, money laundering, racketeering. Objection! Benton screamed, slamming his hand on the table. This is slander. Absolute lies. Is it? Natalie asked calmly. She turned to her young lawyer. Sam, the blue envelope, please. Samuel Kincaid walked over and handed the envelope to the bailiff, who handed it to Judge Harrison. Inside that envelope, Natalie said, facing the judge now, are the original ledgers, the ones Grant thought he burned 3 years ago. He didn't burn them. He gave them to me to hold on to in a safety deposit box that he thought was in his name. It wasn't. Grant felt a cold sweat break out on his back. He remembered the ledgers. He had been drunk one night, paranoid about the IRS, and had given a box of files to Natalie to hide in her gym locker, thinking she was too stupid to look inside. He had retrieved them a week later and burned them, or so he thought. That's impossible, Grant stammered, standing up. I destroyed those. The courtroom went deadly silent. Judge Harrison looked up from the documents inside the envelope. His eyes were wide. Mr. Priscilla, you just stated on the record that you destroyed these documents. Are you admitting they existed? No, I mean, she's lying. Grant's face turned purple. This is a setup. She's a waitress. She doesn't know what a ledger looks like. I learned, Natalie said softly. I had a lot of free time in that penthouse while you were with your mistress. I took online courses, accounting, forensic auditing. I learned exactly how you moved the money from the Cayman accounts to the shell companies in Delaware. Benton Hughes looked pale. He leaned away from his client. Your Honor, Benton said, his voice trembling. I was not aware of any criminal allegations. I am here for a civil divorce proceeding. Sit down, Mr. Hughes, Judge Harrison barked. He looked at the papers again, then back at Natalie. The judge's expression changed. He looked confused not by the evidence, but by something else. He squinted at Natalie, tilting his head. Mrs. Priscilla, the judge said slowly. You say you are from Ohio. That's what my driver's license says. Your Honor, Natalie replied, and your maiden name on the marriage certificate, the judge continued, looking at the file, is Natalie Brooks. Yes, Your Honor. The judge leaned forward, his imposing figure looming over the bench. Ms. Brooks, this court recognizes that the evidence you just submitted is explosive. It could lead to federal indictments. But this is a family court. We deal with assets. If these assets were obtained illegally, the government will seize them, and there will be nothing left for either of you. Is that your goal? Mutually assured destruction. Grant found his voice. She's crazy. She'd rather burn it all down than let me be happy. Natalie smiled. It was a terrifying smile. I don't care about the money, Your Honor. I never did. I care about the lie. Judge Harrison stared at her for a long, uncomfortable minute. He took off his glasses. He looked at her nose, her chin, the specific shape of her eyes. A strange recognition flashed across his face. Miss Brooks, the judge asked, his voice unusually quiet. Where exactly in Ohio are you from? A small town called Oakhaven, she replied. The judge froze. Oakhaven. Yes. And your mother's name? Catherine, Natalie said. Catherine Brooks. The color drained from Judge Harrison's face so fast it looked like he was having a stroke. He dropped his pen. It clattered loudly on the wooden floor. Grant looked between the judge and his wife. He didn't understand what was happening, but the air in the room had shifted. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. Catherine Brooks, the judge whispered. He looked at Grant Priscilla with a sudden intense hatred that Grant could not comprehend. Then he looked back at Natalie. Does your husband know? The judge asked Natalie. Know what? Grant demanded. Know what? Natalie turned to Grant. He doesn't know, Your Honor. He never asked about my family. He never asked about my father. He just assumed I was nobody. Judge Harrison closed the file. He didn't look at the papers anymore. He looked at Grant Priscilla like he was a bug under a microscope. Mr. Priscilla, the judge said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. You are extremely confident in this prenuptial agreement. You believe you can leave this woman on the street. It's the law, Grant said, though his voice wavered. The law, Judge Harrison said, standing up. Do you know who I am? Mr. Priscilla, you "You're Judge Harrison." "My name," the judge said, "is William Harrison. Before I was a judge, I was a prosecutor in Ohio, 30 years ago, in Oak Haven." Grant felt the floor drop out from under him. "And," the judge continued, "I had a relationship with a woman named Catherine Brooks, a relationship that ended abruptly when she moved away. I never knew what happened to her." The judge looked at Natalie, tears welling in his steel-grey eyes. "I never knew she had a child." The entire courtroom gasped. Even the bailiff took a step forward. Judge Harrison pointed a trembling finger at Grant. "You asked me to enforce a contract against my own daughter." Grant's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Who is your wife's father, Mr. Priscilla?" The judge roared, his voice booming off the walls. "It seems you didn't do your due diligence, because you are staring at him." The silence that followed Judge Harrison's revelation was heavy enough to crush bones. For 10 seconds, nobody moved. The court reporter stopped typing her hands, hovering over the keys, her mouth agape. Grant Priscilla, usually the master of every room he entered, looked like a man trying to solve a physics equation in a language he didn't speak. He looked at the judge, whose face was a mask of thunderous emotion, and then at Natalie. "Father!" Grant choked out the word, tasting like ash. That's impossible. She's trash. You're a high court judge." "Bailiff," Judge Harrison roared, ignoring Grant completely. "Take control of this courtroom." 2 uniformed officers stepped forward, their hands resting on their belts, moving instinctively toward Grant's table. Benton Hughes, the shark lawyer, was the first to snap out of the trance. He was sweating profusely. He knew the legal implications of what just happened were catastrophic. "Your Honor, Judge Harrison, if what you say is true, you are conflicted. You must recuse yourself immediately. You cannot preside over this case." Judge Harrison stood tall, his black robes billowing like storm clouds. He looked at Natalie again, his eyes softening with a mixture of heartbreak and pride. Then he turned his steel gaze back to Benton. "You are correct, Counselor," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "I am conflicted. I am emotionally compromised. I cannot rule on the divorce of my own daughter." Grant let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. A laugh bubbled up in his throat, a hysterical, manic sound. "Ha! See, mistrial. This whole thing is a wash. We start over. New judge, new venue. And you," he pointed a shaking finger at Natalie, "you played your hand too early. You think this scares me. You just delayed the inevitable." Grant turned to Benton. "Pack it up. We're leaving. I have a lunch reservation at Le Bernardin." "Sit down, Mr. Priscilla." The judge's voice cracked like a whip. Grant froze. "You just recused yourself. You have no power here." "I have recused myself from the civil matter of the divorce," Harrison said slowly, removing his glasses and placing them on the bench. "I cannot divide your assets. I cannot grant your separation." The judge picked up the blue envelope, the one containing the evidence of money laundering and racketeering. "However," Harrison continued, "I remain a sworn officer of the court and a mandatory reporter of felonies committed in my presence or presented as evidence. This envelope does not contain hearsay, Mr. Priscilla. It contains original ledgers. It contains wire transfer numbers. It contains proof of massive fraud against the United States government." Benton Hughes began quietly packing his briefcase. He knew what was coming. He was already calculating how to distance himself from his client. "Mr. Hughes," the judge said, I assume you are familiar with the mandatory detention guidelines for flight risks involving international financial crimes exceeding $50 million.
Yes, Your Honor, Benton whispered.
Good, Harrison said. He looked at the bailiff. Officer, take Mr. Priscilla into custody. He is to be remanded to the county jail pending a federal arraignment. The evidence in this envelope is to be transferred immediately to the District Attorney's Special Crimes Unit and the FBI field office.
What?
Grant screamed as the bailiff grabbed his arm. You can't do this. This is a vendetta. I'm a billionaire. I'm Priscilla Dynamics. You have the right to remain silent, the bailiff recited in a monotone voice, pulling Grant's expensive suit jacket back to cuff his wrists.
Benton, do something,
Grant yelled, struggling as the cold steel clicked around his wrists.
Fix this.
Benton. Hughes didn't look up. He was busy texting his firm, likely telling them to drop Priscilla Dynamics as a client before the stock market opened.
Grant, I advise you to shut up,
Benton muttered. As Grant was hauled away, kicking and screaming like a petulant child, he looked back at Natalie. She hadn't moved. She hadn't smiled. She was simply watching him with that same unnerving calmness. Once the doors slammed shut on Grant's screaming figure, the courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Judge Harrison stepped down from the bench. He didn't look like a judge anymore. He looked like an old, tired man who had just seen a ghost. He walked around the counsel tables, ignoring the lawyers, ignoring the bailiffs, until he stood 2 feet away from Natalie. He trembled as he reached out a hand, but stopped short of touching her, as if afraid she might vanish. Catherine left. He whispered, his voice thick with 30 years of pain. One day, she was there, and the next, gone. She left a note saying she wasn't ready, saying I was too focused on my career. I looked for her, Natalie. For 5 years, I looked for her. Natalie's mask finally cracked. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She told me you died, she said softly. She told me my father was a good man, who died before I was born. She didn't want me to know I was abandoned. I never abandoned you, Harrison said, tears spilling over now. I didn't know you existed. If I had known, my God, if I had known. I found out 3 years ago, Natalie said, wiping her face. I found a box of old letters my mom hid in the attic after she passed. Letters she wrote to you but never sent. I tracked you down. I saw you were a judge here in New York. Why didn't you tell me? Harrison asked. Because by then I was already married to Grant, Natalie replied, her voice hardening again. I was already trapped, and I knew that if I came to you as his wife, he would use you. He would use your influence. He would corrupt you. I had to wait until I could destroy him first. Harrison looked at his daughter, this stranger, who had his eyes and her mother's chin, and saw a strength he hadn't expected. You planned this. You knew he would file in this county. I made sure of it, Natalie admitted. I made sure his lawyer filed the motion specifically when Judge Miller was on vacation, knowing you were the alternate. I gambled everything on you being the man my mother wrote about in those letters, the man who hated bullies. Harrison let out a shaky breath and finally pulled his daughter into a hug. It was stiff and awkward, filled with decades of missing time. But it was real. You have his money, Harrison whispered into her hair. You have the evidence. You have me. We are going to bury him. The holding cell at the Suffolk County Courthouse smelled of bleach and despair. It was a far cry from the penthouse suite at the Four Seasons. Grant Priscilla sat on a metal bench, His tie loosened his expensive Italian shoes, scuffed. He had been there for 4 hours. "This is a mistake," he muttered to himself for the 100th time. "It's a clerical error. I'll make a call. I'll buy the jail if I have to." The heavy steel door buzzed and clanked open. Grant jumped up, expecting Benton Hughes with a release order. Instead, Natalie walked in. She was no longer the mousy woman from the courtroom. She had changed. She was wearing a tailored white power suit that cost more than Grant's car. Her hair was down, cascading in loose waves, and she wore 4-inch stilettos that clicked sharply on the concrete floor. The guard closed the door, but didn't lock it, standing just outside. "You," Grant snarled, rushing the bars. "You bitch! You set me up. Do you have any idea what you've done to the stock price? I checked the ticker on the guard's phone. Priscilla Dynamics is down 40%. 40%. Natalie, that's billions." Natalie stood calmly on the other side of the bars, checking her nails. "Actually, it's down 52% as of 10 minutes ago. The news of your arrest for money laundering hit the wire. The SEC has suspended trading." "You ruined us," Grant screamed, gripping the bars until his knuckles turned white. "You ruined yourself. The prenup says you get nothing. Remember, if the company tanks, you get half of nothing." Natalie laughed. It was a dark, rich sound. "Oh, Grant, you still don't get it. You think I want your money." She reached into her purse and pulled out a sleek black tablet. She tapped the screen and held it up for him to see. It was a document, a patent registration. "Do you recognize this?" she asked. Grant squinted. "It's the algorithm, the core code for the new AI platform. So what I own it." "Read the author line," Natalie said. Grant read it. Author N.C. Brooks. N.C. Brooks. Grant whispered. "Who is that?" "Natalie Catherine Brooks," she said. "Me." "You," Grant scoffed. "You can barely work a microwave. You were a waitress." "I was a waitress because I was putting myself through a PhD in computer science at MIT online." Natalie said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I met you while I was working my way through grad school. I didn't tell you because I wanted to see if you liked me. When I realized you only liked the idea of owning me, I stayed quiet. I watched you struggle with the code for Priscilla Dynamics. I watched your engineers fail for 2 years. She stepped closer to the bars. Who do you think fixed the code, Grant? Who do you think went into your laptop while you were passed out drunk or with your mistresses and patched the kernel so the system wouldn't crash? Who built the product you're selling? Grant's face went slack. He remembered the mornings when the code would miraculously work after weeks of bugs. He had always assumed his team had pulled an all-nighter. He had taken the credit. You wrote it. I wrote every line, Natalie said. And because I never signed an employment contract with Priscilla Dynamics, and because I filed the patent under my maiden name 3 years ago before you ever invented it, I own it. The company doesn't own the tech, Grant. I do. Grant staggered back and sat heavily on the bench. His world was spinning. But the prenup. Whatever is mine is mine. The prenup covers your assets, Natalie corrected. The patent isn't your asset. It never was. It's mine. And since the company's entire valuation is based on that technology, Priscilla Dynamics is effectively selling a stolen product, which means the company is worthless, Grant whispered. Bingo. Natalie smiled. I'm not taking half your fortune, Grant. I'm taking the source of it. I've already licensed the technology to your biggest competitor, Omnicorp. They signed the deal this morning. The signing bonus alone is more than your entire liquid net worth. Grant looked up at her, his eyes wide with horror. He realized finally that he hadn't been living with a victim. He had been living with a predator who was simply biding her time. "Why?" he croaked. "Why wait 5 years? Why let me humiliate you?" "Because," Natalie said, her voice turning cold as ice, "I needed to know where the bodies were buried. If I had left you 3 years ago, you would have just been a rich ex-husband who stole my code. I needed to destroy you completely. I needed the Cayman ledgers. I needed the wire fraud. I needed to make sure that when I left, you wouldn't be going to a bachelor pad in the Hamptons. You'd be going to federal prison." She turned to leave. "Wait," Grant begged, scrambling to the bars. "Natalie, wait. We can work this out. I can change. We can be a power couple. With your brain and my connections." "You have no connections, Grant," she said without looking back. "Chloe called me, by the way." Grant froze. "Chloe." "She saw the news," Natalie said, pausing at the door. "She wanted to know if the jewelry you bought her was going to be seized by the feds. I told her yes. She told me to tell you to rot in hell. She's already on a plane to Dubai with Brad." "Brad, my VP. Brad has been feeding me info on you for 2 years," Natalie said, opening the door. "He didn't like how you talked to him. People remember how you treat them, Grant. Even the little people." The door slammed shut, leaving Grant alone in the silence. The reality of his situation began to sink in. No money, no company, no friends, no wife. And the judge who held his fate in his hands was the father of the woman he had tormented. He sank to the floor, put his head in his hands, and for the first time in his life, Grant Priscilla began to cry. Not for his loss, but for the terrifying realization that he was and always had been the smallest person in the room. 6 months later, the ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was packed, but not for a gala. It was a liquidation auction. The U.S. Marshals were selling off the seized assets of Grant Priscilla to pay back the millions he had defrauded from investors and the government. Natalie sat in the back row wearing sunglasses and a nondescript trench coat. Next to her sat William Harrison, her father. He was no longer wearing his judicial robes. Today he was just a dad holding a cup of coffee and watching the spectacle with a grim sense of satisfaction. "Lot 402, the auctioneer announced, his voice booming over the speakers. "A Toontant 24 Patek Philippe Nautilus watch, rose gold, barely worn." The bidding started at $50,000 and rapidly climbed to $300,000. "He loved that watch," Natalie whispered. "He told me once that it was worth more than my entire existence." William squeezed her hand. "It's just metal, Nat. It's just metal." "I know," she said, "but watching strangers buy his life, it's strange. I don't feel happy. I just feel relieved." The auction continued. Grant's penthouse had already been sold. His Ferrari, his art collection. Everything that defined him was being stripped away, piece by piece, to cover his debts. Grant, of course, wasn't there to see it. He was currently sitting in the Metropolitan Detention Center, awaiting his final sentencing hearing, which was scheduled for that afternoon. "Are you ready to go?" William asked gently. "We don't want to be late for the finale." Natalie nodded. "Let's go see him one last time." The sentencing hearing was a media circus. Reporters lined the steps of the courthouse, desperate for a glimpse of the fallen billionaire and the secret genius wife. When Natalie and William exited the black SUV, cameras flashed like a lightning storm. Natalie kept her head high, ignoring the questions. Inside the mood was somber. Grant was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit. The arrogance was completely gone. He had lost 20 pounds. His hair, usually dyed and coiffed, was greying at the roots and thinning. He looked like an old man. When he saw Natalie sitting in the front row next to Judge Harrison, he flinched. The presiding judge, a stern woman named Judge Reynolds, since Harrison had recused himself, didn't waste time. "Mr. Priscilla," she began, peering down at him, "you have pleaded guilty to 17 counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. You built an empire on lies, and you treated the people around you as disposable pawns. Do you have anything to say before I pass sentence?" Grant stood up. His hands were shaking in the cuffs. I just want to say, I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice cracking. He looked at Natalie. "Natalie, I'm sorry." Natalie didn't blink. She didn't offer a sympathetic smile. She just watched him, impassive. "The court notes your apology," Judge Reynolds said dryly. "However, remorse does not undo the damage. You defrauded the American public of over $200 million. You attempted to hide these assets using your wife unknowingly, implicating her in your crimes. That betrayal alone speaks to a character deficit that is truly staggering." Grant hung his head. "I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison," the judge declared. The gavel banged with a finality that echoed through the room. "With no possibility of parole for the first 20 years. You are also ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $150 million. Grant's knees buckled. His lawyer had to hold him up. 25 years. He would be 63 years old when he got out. His life was effectively over. As the bailiffs moved to drag him away, Grant looked back at Natalie one last time. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to beg, perhaps to scream. But he saw William Harrison put a protective arm around her shoulders. Grant realized then that he hadn't just lost a wife. He had fought a war against a family he didn't even know existed, and he had lost everything. The concept of time in Federal Correctional Institution Fort Dix was not measured in hours, minutes, or seconds. It was measured in the slow, agonizing drip of indignity. For Grant Priscilla, formerly the master of the Manhattan Universe time, was now a physical weight. It had been 365 days since the gavel banged down, sealing his fate. 1 year, 12 months of waking up to the metallic shriek of a buzzer instead of the gentle chime of a smart alarm. 12 months of trading his 400 thread-count Egyptian cotton sheets for a scratchy wool blanket that smelled faintly of mildew and other men's sweat. He was no longer Mr. Priscilla, the man who could move markets with a single tweet. He was inmate 8940C. Grant sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at his hands. They were unrecognizable. The manicured nails and soft skin, once maintained by weekly appointments at a private spa on Fifth Avenue, were gone. His knuckles were swollen, the skin dry and cracked, the fingernails jagged and rimmed with grey dirt that no amount of scrubbing could remove. "Move it, Priscilla!" a guard bellowed, banging a baton against the bars. "Chow time. Don't make me tell you twice." Grant stood up slowly. His lower back ached constantly now, a souvenir from his assigned prison job. The king of tech was now part of the sanitation crew, specifically the latrine duty for cell block D. He spent 8 hours a day scrubbing grout with a toothbrush and mopping up filth. A cruel irony that he was certain the universe had designed specifically for him. He shuffled out of his cell, joining the line of men in matching beige jumpsuits. The noise was deafening, a constant cacophony of shouting, clanging metal, and aggressive laughter. He kept his head down. In the first month, he had tried to assert dominance. He had tried to tell the other inmates who he was, about his billions, about his connections. That had resulted in a fractured rib and a black eye. He learned quickly that in here, his net worth was zero. Actually, it was less than zero. He was a white-collar crook who stole from grandmas and pension funds. Even the murderers looked down on him. The cafeteria was a cavernous room that smelled of boiled cabbage and industrial cleaner. Grant took his tray, a slab of grey meatloaf that leaked a watery orange grease, and found a seat at the far end of a metal table alone. He ate mechanically, trying not to taste the food. He thought about the anniversary. Today marked 1 full year. 24 more to go. He would be an old man when he walked out. If he walked out. Priscilla. Grant flinched, dropping his plastic fork. He looked up to see Officer Miller, the mail-room guard, walking toward him. Miller was a heavy-set man who seemed to derive a specific pleasure from Grant's misery. "You got something?" Miller grunted, tossing a large, heavy envelope onto the table. It landed with a thud, sliding through a puddle of water. Grant stared at it. The envelope was thick, reinforced with cardboard. He frowned. He never got mail. In the beginning, he had waited every day. He waited for Benton Hughes to tell him the appeal was working. He waited for Chloe to send a letter saying she was waiting for him. He waited for his business partners to check in. But the silence had been absolute. Benton had dropped him the second the retainer check bounced. Chloe had posted a photo on Instagram from a yacht in Dubai 3 days after his sentencing, wearing the diamond necklace he bought her, with the caption, "New Beginnings." Grant wiped his hands on his jumpsuit and picked up the envelope. It had no return address, just a postmark from New York City. His heart hammered against his ribs. Was it legal news? A new charge. He tore the tab on the envelope. The paper was high quality, thick, expensive. He slid the contents out. It wasn't a legal briefing. It was a magazine. Fortune and Innovation. The 50 most influential people of the year. Grant stared at the cover, his breath catching in his throat. He blinked, sure that the prison lighting was playing tricks on him. He rubbed his eyes and looked again. It was her. Natalie. But it wasn't the Natalie he remembered, the quiet, mousy woman who wore cardigans and fetched him espresso. This woman looked like a titan. She was standing on the roof of a glass skyscraper, the wind catching her hair, her chin tilted up with a fierce, unapologetic confidence. She wore a sharp, navy blue power suit that fit her perfectly, and her eyes, those eyes he had ignored for 5 years, were piercing through the camera lens. The headline was embossed in gold foil, "The Silent Architect." How Natalie Brooks reclaimed her code, crushed the competition, and built a $10 billion empire. Grant felt a wave of nausea. He opened the magazine with trembling fingers, the glossy pages feeling alien against his rough skin. He found the feature article. For years, Silicon Valley wondered who was really behind the revolutionary Priscilla algorithm, the article began. We assumed it was the brash, loud-mouthed CEO, Grant Priscilla. We were wrong. The genius was sitting quietly in the background, serving tea and writing code that would change the world. Grant read on his eyes, scanning the text frantically. The article detailed everything. It described how Natalie had launched Brooks Tech using the patent she had secretly registered. It described how she had hired the top engineers, many of whom Grant had fired for insubordination, and built a culture of transparency and innovation. It detailed the acquisition of his former company's assets. When Priscilla Dynamics was liquidated by the federal government, the article read, "Brooks Tech was the highest bidder." Natalie Brooks bought her ex-husband's former headquarters for pennies on the dollar. She turned the executive penthouse suite, formerly Grant Priscilla's private party room, into a daycare center for her employees. Grant let out a choked sound, halfway between a sob and a cough. His office, his sanctuary, a daycare. He flipped the page. There was a Q&A section with Natalie. Interviewer: You went through a very public, very difficult divorce right before your launch. How did that shape you, Natalie Brooks? It was clarifying. I was married to a man who measured his worth by how small he could make others feel. He thought power was about shouting and intimidation. He taught me exactly what kind of leader I didn't want to be. In a way, I owe him a thank you. His arrogance gave me the time I needed to perfect my product. If he had paid even 5 minutes of attention to me, he would have seen what I was doing. But he was too busy looking in the mirror. Interviewer: You've also been very public about reconnecting with your father, the Honorable William Harrison. Natalie Brooks: Yes. Finding my father was the greatest gift of this entire ordeal. He is the chairman of our charitable foundation now. We spend every Sunday together. He's the man I wish I had known my whole life. Grant slammed the magazine shut. He couldn't read anymore. It was too much light, too much success, too much happiness for a man living in the dark. She had taken everything. She hadn't just defeated him. She had erased him. She had taken his company, his building, his reputation, and even the narrative of his life. He went to shove the magazine back into the envelope, wanting to throw it in the trash, when he felt something else inside. A smaller, stiffer piece of paper. He reached in and pulled it out. It was a small white envelope sealed with a piece of tape. On the front, in handwriting, he recognized instantly, elegant looped cursive, was a single word: closure. Grant ripped it open. Inside was a single printed ticket. Greyhound Bus Lines. Passenger. One-way departure. New York Port Authority. Destination: Oak Haven, Ohio. Date open. Valid until 2050. Grant stared at the ticket. The destination blurred before his eyes. Oak Haven, the town she was from. The cornfield he had mocked 1,000 times. He turned the ticket over. A yellow sticky note was attached to the back. Grant. I remember the night before the hearing. You were standing on the ottoman with a bottle of champagne, telling your friends that I would leave the marriage with a suitcase of Target t-shirts and a bus ticket back to the cornfields. I wanted to make sure you were prepared for your release. I kept the t-shirts. I use them as rags to clean the daycare center now. But I bought you the ticket. I calculated the inflation for the year 2050. It should still be valid when you get out. It's a long ride, about 14 hours. You'll have plenty of time to look out the window and think about the wife you called a fixer-upper. Safe travels. Nat P.S. I own the bus company now, too. The sounds of the cafeteria, the shouting, the clanking trays, the guards yelling faded into a dull hum. The world narrowed down to that small rectangular piece of paper in his hand. The pettiness was surgical. It was absolute. She hadn't just beaten him. She had remembered every single cruel word he had ever spoken to her and weaponized them. She had held on to that specific insult for 5 years, waiting for the exact moment when it would inflict the maximum amount of damage. Grant looked at the meatloaf on his tray. He looked at the gray walls. He looked at the bus ticket to Ohio. A laugh bubbled up in his chest. It wasn't a happy laugh. It wasn't a sane laugh. It was a dry, rattling sound, like dead leaves scraping across concrete. He started to chuckle. The chuckle turned into a cackle. The inmate across from him, a large man with a spiderweb tattoo on his face, looked up. "Yo, Priscilla, you cracking up, man." Grant couldn't stop. He laughed until tears streamed down his face, cutting tracks through the grime on his cheeks. He laughed until his stomach cramped. He laughed because the joke was so perfect, so complete, and he was the punchline. He had celebrated taking everything. He had thought he was a god. And now he was just a janitor with a bus ticket to Ohio, waiting for a bus that wouldn't come for 24 years. He clutched the ticket to his chest like it was a lifeline curled forward over his tray, and let the laughter dissolve into racking, silent sobs. From the glossy cover of the magazine, Natalie Brooks smiled her enigmatic smile, looking past him toward a future that he would never, ever touch. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the definition of the long game. Grant Priscilla spent 5 years underestimating his wife, thinking his money made him invincible. He didn't realize that while he was building a house of cards, Natalie was building a fortress of evidence, patience, and brilliance. In the end, the waitress from Ohio served him the coldest dish of revenge possible, a one-way ticket to the very life he mocked paid for by the fortune he tried to steal. It just goes to show that character always outlasts cash. Grant thought he could buy his way out of anything, but he couldn't buy class, and he certainly couldn't buy his way out of federal prison. "I want to know your thoughts," was Natalie's final gift with the bus ticket. Too petty, or was it the perfect poetic justice? Would you have been that patient? Let me know in the comments section below. If this story gave you chills, please smash that like button and share this video with a friend who loves a good karma story. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a beat. We have more shocking stories of arrogance and justice coming your way tomorrow. Thanks for watching, and stay humble.